coming to the session, which will, in a sense, close this conference on a high. The session is called Lessons from the Spring and Thoughts for the Future. And the speaker is Dean Bridget T. Long, who is Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The session is going to be moderated by Mr. Siddharth, founder of Ashoka University. Siddharth, who prefers to be called Sid, is the founding partner of Xander Group Incorporated. He is also founder and chairman of Virtuous Retail. From 2014 to 2019, Sid served on the Harvard Business School faculty, where he wrote cases and taught courses on investing in emerging markets and real property asset management. He has previously worked with CBRE in Hong Kong, Singapore, and India, and with Bain & Company in New York. In 2006, he was voted by Private Equity Real Estate magazine as one of 20 global stars of the future. Sid is also a member of the President's Global Advisory Council and of the Committee on University Resources at Harvard University. He is also a co-founder and member of the governing body at Ashoka University in India, member of the Board of Trustees at the American Repertory Theatre in Cambridge, member of the International Advisory Council at Lincoln Center in New York, and chair of Yuj Kutum, the Yog Foundation. Sid received a BA in economics from the University of Delhi and was head of the Students' Union at Sri Ram College of Commerce. He earned an MBA with high distinction from Harvard Business School and was elected both a Baker Scholar and president of his class. Sid, over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, but I'm here actually to introduce our session's speaker, the last speaker for the day, Dr. Bridget Terry Long, who is Dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's been a member of the HGSE faculty since the year 2000. Dean Long is an economist whose scholarship has focused on educational access and student outcomes for a very long time. It's fair to say she's a pioneering researcher, she's a seasoned practitioner, and she's been an influential policymaker in her own right, broadly influencing policy in the United States and obviously influencing policy at the Harvard Graduate School of Education now. She has many accolades to her name, but let me just cite a few. She is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, where she was elected to become a member of the National Academy of Education. She's also a fellow of the International Academy of Education. President Obama appointed her to the National Board for Education Sciences, an advisory panel at the US Department of Education, where she went on to serve as vice chair and then chair during her appointment. She is a noted researcher and has been called to testify many times before various congressional committees. She's also a visiting fellow at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Bridget, or Dean Long, earned her PhD and her master's from Harvard University's Department of Economics, and earlier she secured her undergraduate degree from Princeton University, where also she read economics. Earlier this month, the Harvard Graduate School of Education became the first graduate school at Harvard University to switch to offering a complete online program for the coming academic year. I think pretty much it's been the first time that a major graduate school at Harvard University, or perhaps any other university of note, has done so. What is quite amazing also is the speed with which the school managed to pivot to an offering which many would have considered unlikely just a few months ago. So I can think of no better person to talk to us about what opportunities and challenges are likely to confront us as we take this path towards a more online education, focused on our lessons learned in this spring gone by, and looking forward to the future that is in front of us. With no more ado, can I hand over to Bridget Terry Long, Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Saris Professor of Education and Economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Bridget, to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be able to join all of you I know this is afternoon for you. It's very early morning for me in Boston, but I'm glad that I could be here. And I want to say special thanks to Sid, who has been a longtime friend and supporter. I'm so glad that we could continue our partnership and engage on such important issues. I understand that you've had an absolutely fantastic conference, really focused on a number of important things that so many schools, educators, families are going through around the world focused on COVID. And I do want to take a moment to send special greetings to my former students and to many of my alumni from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I know that there are a few of you in the audience, and it is absolutely wonderful to connect with you again. So as Sid said, I have been studying issues of educational access and opportunity for over 20 years, very active as a researcher in the economics of education, and now leading the Harvard Graduate School of Education. My work and my time is really spent straddling running my own institution. And so I join you, as a leader who's had to make a number of important decisions very, very quickly and move a team of people, but also spending a great deal of time with our partners. The Harvard Graduate School of Education is very outward focused. We work with many of our alumni. We have 29,000 alumni around the world, many partner schools and districts, both in the United States and outside of it. And so we have taken it very seriously that part of our mission and our responsibility is try to support our partners, our schools, and to try to share our expertise, help them connect with each other, as so many are making really important decisions about how to continue to support their students. So what I'm bringing to you today is both what I am seeing within Harvard and what has been the conversation in higher education, but more importantly, we have been engaging in many ways, big and small, with our alumni and with practitioners in the field. We did a fairly large survey about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, with schools all over the United States and some outside. And it was amazing. In 3 days, we got about 4,000 responses with people telling us what are the big issues that are on their mind. And this has been important for us as we've tried to think more about our strategy. But I'll share with you some of what we have learned from the spring that different schools have tried. Some have been more successful than others. And then what people are thinking about for the fall, and some considerations that I might suggest as you continue your conversations. I'm also happy to share a bit about our decisions at the Harvard Graduate School of Education to take a very bold step and to make the decision that we were going to be online for the entire 2020-2021 academic year, which we just publicly announced this week. So to help ground the presentation, I'm going to share my screen with you. Just a few slides with some of my major points. And so hopefully they'll give you some takeaways. So I just want to start by motivating perhaps more with the United States context. There's been a lot of discussion. The abrupt move to remote learning took many people by surprise. I think that's quite unfortunate. It didn't have to be that way if information had been shared differently for a number of reasons, but it was very abrupt. And so conversations have begun, and I think this is going to be true across the world, conversations about a lost generation. There was a New York Times article from mid-April that talks a bit about students who are lacking steady academic instruction, who might only retain a small part of what they learned during the last academic year, in particular for math. Very, very concerned about a slide there. So not only do we have summer learning loss, which is a great concern in the United States, but we also have just the loss of their learning from this academic year. How much are they actually going to be able to retain? In the US, this change came at about the 3/4 mark, for some around a little bit earlier than that. So students lost really the last quarter of what their academic year would have been. And so this question of how this is going to hobble a generation, and I would expect for years to come, we are going to look at this period of time and notice lots of changes in transcripts and learning, and depending on how we are able to reset going forward is going to determine whether or not we are feeling the effects of this for the next year, 10 years, 20 years, or even beyond. So as we look at the spring, what are some of the key lessons and takeaways? And again, I'm drawing this from some research that we've been doing with a major survey, but also a number of conversations I've had with superintendent system leaders around the United States, the private schools, consortia, and other big policy leaders. So some of the key takeaways, the difference between who were able to weather this storm a bit better than others was the difference of which leaders in which schools were ready to accept and understand and face the realities of how much was changing. You see two very different groups. The groups that saw the writing that was on the wall, the strong possibility that we were going to have to switch to remote, whether that was just looking at the science or looking what was happening in other countries. The people who saw that, and even the difference of a week of realizing how quickly they were going to have to prepare students, prepare teachers to send materials home, whether that was paper or computers, and who quickly said, you know, we have to throw out all of our assumptions about how we work, about whose responsibility it is for A or B, and just all hands on deck, make sure everyone is focused on the goal of preparing in very short amounts of time, 3 days, maybe up to a week, of making sure students have what they needed at home. I contrast that with other districts, other schools who were waiting for someone else to tell them what to do. There were a number of schools, principals, who were waiting for perhaps their district leader to make the call, or for someone else to tell them, yes, this is what's going to happen. And so they were following business as usual up to the very last moment. And when children were sent home, they did not have time to prepare materials for them. And they did not have time to prepare their teaching staffs for critical group meetings face-to-face about how expectations were changing and how their jobs were going to change. So that made all the difference in the world. And I think for my institution, one of the things that we have tried to do is be very pragmatic in many ways. We have continued to be optimistic, and we continue to look for the possibility that we might be able to be physically together. But we also were completely honest with ourselves that that possibility for our context is fairly low. And so we needed to be much more proactive in building a strategy that took into account and started thinking in new ways. And as I have said to my team multiple times, we cannot rely on the old ways of assuming whose job, whose role, how things were going to work. And instead, we had to become focused on the goal, and everyone needed to figure out how they were going to contribute to that goal. And this gets me to my second point, the importance of teams and collaborative cultures within schools. You can see a major difference. And in the US, it's actually often the private schools and some of the charter schools, which have a private element, even though they're still public schools, where the school leaders, the teachers already had a very collaborative culture. They already had strong collaborations with parents. And so when things quickly were happening, the ability to bring everyone together and have them work strongly as a team, as well as to communicate very important information that was constantly evolving, made all the difference in the world. Whereas schools where teachers were not used to working together, were not used to sharing resources, where they did not have good rapport with parents, are the ones that failed the most, who have struggled the most in order to try to continue to support their educational mission, as well as trying to get their educators additional professional development and materials, and to share practices across classrooms about what is working and what is not. And then third, very important in our context, and I think this is true for the world, you know, so oftentimes people think about education only being the academic, but we know our educators do so much more than that in supporting the human development of our students, and also providing things like food, nutrition, safety. A big concerning fact in the US is when we went to remote learning, reports of issues of child endangerment and child abuse have gone down, because we no longer have teachers seeing students face to face to recognize when something is wrong inside of a family. There's a lot of concerns that we are missing things with students now that we don't see them. And for so many of our low-income students who have not been connecting remotely with their teachers at all, there's a real concern that they are somehow being missed. There's also the issue of food, which is on the slide, food insecurity, poverty being such a huge problem, and our system is built on so much of that food, so much of the addressing that issue is implemented through our schools. So we had a number of our large cities that delayed closing down the schools because they had to figure out how they were still going to distribute breakfasts and lunches to families. And that became the primary goal rather than the academics and other pieces of it. So that just gives you 3 quick lessons and observations across all different kinds of schools and levels about what made the difference for the spring. But as we look to the future, and I know in India, your schools are about to start the new academic year sooner than we are. I know that this is certainly top of mind. I want to point out 2 complications that we have to think about how to address. The first one being that our students are going to arrive being at vastly different levels of academic learning. There's going to be tremendous variation in their learning levels. For some, they went home, they had parents, or you were able to provide supports, or they may have been at an age where they were able to work independently, where perhaps they were able to continue with their learning. They were able to get most of the content that they would have at that particular grade, and perhaps even outside of school continued learning. There are going to be others who, once they were sent home, learning stopped. And so not only did learning stop and they didn't continue to get additional content, but now if they have been out of touch with schools, and for us, we're calculating some students would have been out of touch with schools for up to 6 months. That's not only content that they did not receive, but it is also the learning loss of just being outside of this constant routine and supporting their memory and their learning. So we know that when students come back to us, that a 4th grader is not going to be a 4th grader. There's going to be a tremendous amount of variation. We're not going to be able to assume that 11-year-olds know this content and we're just dealing with summer learning loss. For us, we're going to know that we're going to have some students who are going to be as much as a half grade level behind their peers. So how are we going to assess that? How are we going to support that? And then the second piece, the importance of student mental health and the need for social emotional supports in schools. And talking to the principal of my children's own private school, he said something that really stuck with me. You know, that when students come back in the fall, it's not only content gaps that we have to worry about, it's the emotional gaps. And given variation and how COVID has impacted communities, we are going to have students who are facing trauma because it has directly impacted someone in their family. The being home, perhaps for some, unfortunately, in abusive neighborhoods or families, they are dealing with a lot of the uncertainty and stress that the adults are also feeling. So they're going to come back into our schools with greater needs than ever before.
Bridget,
so on my last slide, I'm just going to leave you with some thoughts about considerations for the future, and then hopefully we'll open it up for questions. The first is the importance of data analysis and research. As an economist, I can say my love of data has been true for decades, but it's certainly important right now. One, we need to have a better understanding of what worked from the spring so that we don't lose that learning and we can continue the practices that worked versus those did not. And every context had to adapt in different ways, but sharing those practices across schools, sharing for your teachers to share them across classrooms is going to be vitally important because that is an important way of transmission of professional development. But if we don't have data, if we don't have some kind of analysis or documentation, we are going to lose the hard-won battles of what did go right during the spring. It's also very important to know what went wrong so that we don't repeat those problems. But data are also going to be important in assessing current needs, assessing where students are in terms of their learning, assessing what they have at home and what parents were able to help supplement or not, where teachers are in their professional development and their comfort level. You know, as we looked going back to school, many of us are assuming it's not going to be business as usual in residence, and that we are expecting that we will have some time, perhaps in the classroom, Sometime when we're remote, we may be splitting classes to de-densify classrooms, things like that. And so you're really going to have to assess, if your teachers are those that are on the ground, what skills, what resources they have, and what do they need. And so figuring out how to do that. And again, I point to, just basic surveys we've done to just capture what is most on people's minds so that we can respond with expertise, with the resources to help train people and prepare for what's ahead. The second thing is we're going to have to adapt our systems to match the learning and to the support needs of students. The important thing to keep in mind is we need to meet them where they are, and we can't make assumptions about where they have been in their learning. We have seen tremendous differences in the success of remote learning by low income versus high income students. The variation is tremendous, but there are also differences we're seeing by type of learner that aren't obvious from the surface. So we can't make assumptions. We are going to need formative assessments to try to understand where students are, what they retained, what they received versus not. And personalization is going to be important. How teachers split students into classrooms, how hopefully they continue to use technology to supplement in ways, and again, meeting students where they are for their particular learning needs. Increasing learning time, it seems like it's an obvious thing. For the US context, some districts had already been thinking a lot about summer learning and extended learning time. You now, for the first time, see this as a much larger movement where teachers' unions and other groups are understanding we may have to think about Saturdays. We still have the possibility of using summer to increase learning time. But just we have to be creative and think, again, outside of the box, lowering some assumptions about what a school day is, to think more about the goal of giving students the content and the support that they need. And then finally, because I know we're all resource constrained, and given what's happening economically, we expect this to continue. We have to think expansively about educator capacity and think widely beyond just teachers, school counselors, learning specialists, nurses, teaching assistants, but how do we do that with constrained resources? That brings in the piece about partners. Partners are going to be absolutely important, whether they are community-based organizations, companies who can somehow help provide additional resources, or people, whether that's after-school programs, tutors, and so forth. There have been a lot of movement of hiring some of our young people who are out of work given high unemployment, but having them instead be working as tutors. And this is a model that has been incredibly successful with Jeffrey Canada of the Harlem Children's Zone, which has been a very successful model in New York City. And he's talked extensively about the way they were able to do this is through partnerships, is everyone in the neighborhood, everyone in the community coming together to help not only inside the school day, but also outside of the school day. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we can open up the Q&A.
Bridget, thank you for that. That was a wonderful introduction. I did want to mention that at some point your slides stopped moving. So if it's possible for you to share your slides with the Ashoka team later, so some of the,
Absolutely.
So very
so I apologize for that. Absolutely.
Although, as I always say, the slides are a distraction because you were there, so we should have been. So I hope that was indeed the case. And we've had a few questions as you were speaking, so maybe I can start with a couple of questions to begin with. The first one really is around assessments, right? And you referred to it in a different manner. You said that outcomes will be different. And this is related to online assessment in terms of purely online programs, mid-term assessments or final year assessments in a grade system. How would that work in a purely online offering?
Right. So yes, this is difficult. This is one part of, I think, online and remote teaching that has been behind some of the other innovations in pedagogy and so forth. I think the first thing, though, to remember, whether it's online or face-to-face, it's pedagogy and the approach to learning first. I think one of the wonderful things as we have had to move to online education and others as well, it causes you to be very deliberate with what are the learning goals. You can't just throw up a lecture. You have to think very concretely about what is the content, what are the learning goals, and what do we expect students to be able to demonstrate at the end of this lesson. And that's what guides what are those online assessments going to be. For some of this, when I think about math and I think about some of the programs that my own children have used, where there is one right answer, there's lots you can do in terms of assessments that are more kind of multiple choice or inputting the number and quickly checking along the way where a student falls off the pathway, and kind of adaptive testing to hone in on what skills they have versus not. It becomes much more difficult if it's something like writing and reading and so forth. But this is where I think, we have to be careful with the technology and not understanding that the technology can bolster what the educator is doing, but it's still a requirement that educators need to connect with their students. Feedback continues to be important. Having students understand comments and so forth on writing and where they need additional strengths. I think the technology is continuing to go forward, and this is a little bit outside my area, about how to do assessments that you are using more artificial intelligence, and I think there are fantastic ones there. What hasn't yet become clear, given there's a great deal of innovation, is the lens of the quality control to identify, well, which systems really are the best or not. And this is where a great deal of research is going on, as school districts are having to pull, schools everywhere having to pull different programs and are experiencing them. We need to actually know if they're having good experiences, if they feel they're accurate or not, so that we can understand which ones are the better ones versus not.
Great, thank you. You mentioned about, obviously, the difference in resource availability for different students. In India, we have about 250 million students, many of whom come from very underprivileged backgrounds. They don't have many resources. In fact, for many, going to school, much as in the US, you alluded to this in your talk, going to school, whether it's for a midday meal or for just spending those 6 hours in a different environment, is very much an enabling environment for learning. With online learning, especially, one is the access to technology, which we hope is going to rapidly increase, especially with what we're seeing. But two is also the environment in which many of these children live. One-room tenements, if at all, shared with multiple members of the family. And obviously, this is as much a technology question as it is an enabling environment question. But what kinds of things are you seeing already happen? Because human beings are innovative. They find new ways of doing things. Can you share any interesting or imaginative models or ways that people have responded to this challenge in enabling children who are in these environments to still be able to continue with their learning?
Yes, no, this is a really huge challenge, and one that we worry about continuing, depending on whether or not our schools can open, or if they can open but only with being de-densified with not as many students. Some of the most innovative things that I've seen, I don't know if it's innovation, but it is, getting rid of the old assumptions, is again thinking about education as beyond the school and thinking of educators as beyond just teachers. It is the community-based organizations. It's everything from other families, neighborhood organizations, businesses, people who usually don't even think of being part of the educational process. One, they have space. Two, they have people. And if they can coordinate, what I have seen is if the children are going to be out of school and they are in an environment where it's not that they have private space or technology to really be able to focus, thinking more of communities of how are we going to rotate. And so perhaps the students are all with one, come together with one set of families during one day that rotates through the community as parents are trying to figure out how do they keep kids engaged. It is, again, the community-based organizations, which have a very prominent role in many of our communities, who are doing after-school programs, who have gyms and playgrounds and so forth, who have been stepping up and saying, okay, if you're not in school, or some of you are not in school, this is a safe place for you to come. It's been our libraries and other places. And now what you're starting to see is the private sector, the businesses also contributing to this, because they do have the capacity of people who are thinking in creative ways of what can they offer that is still engaging to students, or what spaces can they bring students together. It looks different in every community. It all depends on what assets that particular community happens to have, what capacities or people are able to come together and coordinate. But you have to think beyond just the school building, because schools, given all the limitations and everything that are going on, can't be the only places where we gather students or where support comes from.
And the second, obviously, related question to that is the training of the trainers themselves,
Yes.
whether they be professional trainers, or as you alluded to, that people who are bridging that gap and becoming the sort of official or unofficial trainers, but actually playing that big role in bridging that gap. What kinds of resources are we seeing being developed for those trainers,
Yes.
especially at the Harvard Graduate School of Education itself, or others around the world? How do we help train these new trainers,
Right.
not just old trainers, but the new ones?
So there's been this dilemma where we actually do know a great deal about how to have tremendous experiences in remote learning, but how do you get that information out there? It is a simple fact. If you're trying to learn a new skill, the best way to help transmit that, or have trainers train others, is through conversation and sharing concrete ways to actually implement. So bringing together teachers in conversation to say, what did you do today that worked, that didn't work? And having someone serve as a facilitator is amazing, as I've heard across districts, has been the fastest way to do professional development for teachers. The key thing is you need to have leadership and the ability to bring and kind of, again, facilitate these conversations where teachers are figuring this out. They may be figuring out only one aspect, but if they don't have the ability to share, that knowledge stops. So the issue with right now, when we can't be physically together, and something that Harvard has been trying to do, and I know others, is to build those communities online. So one thing that we are just launching right now is something called the Principals Network, where school leaders of all types all around the world, it's a community they can come together, and we are giving our expertise in leadership and remote teaching, but most importantly, perhaps, is the fact that leaders can talk to each other. School leaders are posting questions and having other leaders make suggestions about what they have done to try to address that issue versus not. And we're going to be using that to also facilitate groups around key dilemmas, key issues, where you can have these school leaders talking to each other about what they've tried and what they haven't. But because we physically can't be together, and because, quite frankly, we're spread around the world, you need these kinds of platforms for leaders to be able to connect with each other. And I think this conference also being a great example where you can share what is working versus not, because again, in a very short amount of time, so many different educators have had to try a number of different things. Again, things that have worked and things that haven't, but we need to be able to connect and share those stories. And we are trying to take the role, and I know of others, to inject actually what we do know from the research about what works and what doesn't. But it's going to land and be used much more readily if one teacher is teaching another teacher.
Thanks, Bridget. Bridget, I have been tracking questions from the audience. So I'm going to try and address a few of those at the moment.
Okay.
This is an interesting one. In the new world, you as an educator, what's your opinion of what are the new skills students need to build in this innovative, challenging, and changing atmosphere? Has anything changed? Are there new types of skills that should be the focus now?
Yes, I think we've known for a long time critical thinking and being able to adapt is important. But I think the last several months have made clear they are the absolutely essential skills. How do you take in new information that may be surprising? How do you reconcile it? How do you use that information to pivot, to make different decisions? This has been important for leaders. This has been important for students. It will continue to be important as the world continues to change. So this issue of being able to bring in information, sort it, analyze it, understand what the priorities are, and then what the implications are for the next thing that students do. Also important are, communication, whether that is, verbally or in written format. So, these kind of key skills that we've known about for a long time, again, I think have only become more important. And at Harvard, I end up talking with many of the other deans and the university president often, and we make this joke that what makes great leaders is a strong liberal arts education. And by that, I mean, it was this emphasis on writing, reading, analyzing data, and adapting and to help understand the world and understand where we go forward. That's what leaders need to do. And that's still a critical skill for students, which makes it difficult, in online environments. Most of our most successful, easy to use apps are more about concrete facts or skills. But it is that interaction with how do you take in this new piece of information, form a different opinion or a different action. And so that's why I think even with many of our platforms, it'll be important to still have the personal touch and the interaction with the student, rather than we're not, I don't think, quite at the point where AI can, guide a number of those kind of building those critical skills, although that's changing quite rapidly as well.
And linked to that, this is another question from a member of the audience, but it's interesting because it kind of links to the sense of belonging. Schools especially are foundational in our sense of belonging. I mean, the physicality of the space, the routine, the fact that you have a peer group, you have a network, you have your mentors. So not just other activities that may happen at school, sports, extracurriculars, which are all part of the learning process, but are also very deeply foundational in us becoming who we become. How would that evolve in a virtual or an online world? What would replace that?
Yes, very big question. When we transferred to remote this year, we already knew the students. We had already had them for 3/4 of the year. As we look ahead, we are bringing on new students who we haven't met face to face. And so how do we establish those relationships, trust, and belonging, in the peer group? Thankfully, with younger generations, they're already somewhat used to using technology to connect with each other. But we have had to think expansively. So what can the technology support and perhaps even do better? Even though, yes, it's not going to be the same thing as residential. So several observations. One, for some students who may be on the shyer side, more anxiety, particularly our low-income students, first-generation students who are not used to or somewhat intimidated by the Harvard environment, the online space actually gives them a bit of safety. It allows them to enter into discussions and meeting other people in a way that feels less frightening. And so giving lots of opportunities for small group and larger group, you were finding for some students, it's actually feeling more comfortable. But how do we move that into deeper conversations? I think that's very dependent on what is the content that you are talking about. So we are doing some experiments right now. If you're aware of what's going on in the US, there is a tremendous amount of upheaval and unrest because of the racism and the racial injustice that's going on. And we're hearing it from our students, even though they haven't officially started the school year. And so we've been experimenting with bringing them together to have conversations about how they're feeling and seeing if they are bringing forth and being honest and bringing forth the emotion that so many people are feeling. And we're seeing that. And I think that's actually those exchanges, even though they're just by Zoom, it's building connections because people are sharing themselves, they're building trust. And we're doing this before, the academic content is going to begin in earnest this fall. So, we are still pushing on one-on-one connections, small group connections. We are seeing what we can do with that. And then there are lots of other social things. We had everything from birthday parties to dance parties to fun trivia and jokes. With my faculty at faculty meeting. I mean, we're trying all different kinds of things, and we're going to have to continue to do that because it's not going to be one size fits all.
Right. Here's a question that has been asked multiple times in different ways by different members of the audience, and I'm going to add my little layer on top of it as the moderator. You're an economist. Your research is based on data, a lot of data, a lot of scientific analysis of that data, a lot of qualitative and quantitative analysis. I think the question that is being asked is, how do we make students of various age groups across sort of, and especially in primary and secondary grades, aware of the importance of data analysis, and how do we introduce this topic in class?
Yes, in class with students or with the teachers and leaders?
I guess both.
Okay, yes. So I think it's important. So when you think about the adoption of new information or new technologies, it's important to have an early win or to show the value of that very, very quickly. And so even for my faculty, we have been adopting new technologies because we are now working remote. And of course, there are some who are somewhat reluctant or worried that, why do we have to do this? And so the key part is to show the value. So for us, it has been everything with our engagement, and immediately afterwards said, look, this is what we learned from the data, and this is how it's going to help you serve students better. So we have couched everything with our data, and the data are going to help you do your job better. It is, and we are being very mission focused, wanting to be very student centric. And I know for so many of my faculty and staff, if I can frame it in a way that is about the students will be better off because we have better information and how to meet their needs. And so that's how you always couch it. The second way to couch it, and this is where in my own research and working with primary and secondary schools where they're not sure, is the point of, I'm trying to make your job easier. I'm trying to use this technology or use these data so that you're not wasting time on things that actually aren't going to help you towards your goal. I'm going to help you be able to prioritize and know that how you're focusing your time is actually going to have benefits. So, I mean, these data can, I would start with something that seems very real and to the ground. So depending on the audience that you're speaking with, if it's students, and it's very young children, just understanding and knowing the basics of, are they paying attention or do they have books at home, and how that might influence what you do in the classroom or what you send home to them. Again, on a very, very basic level, if their concern is small children, then you need to be showing data that it very much ties to, helping them do a better job with small children. If it's with students, again, you have to think about what is the element that they care about and what kind of data will help them think differently about the world or know or change their behavior in some way. So it's very much, I am an economist and I love data, but I think the best economists, the best researchers are ones who actually think very carefully about audience and think very carefully about who they're in conversation with and what that person cares about, because you need to match that regardless of kind of what data and so forth. If it's too disconnected, people won't see the value.
Right. You earlier talked about personalization of learning in one of the answers that you gave. Member of the audience is keen perhaps for you to be able to suggest, if you could, 3 simple ways in which teachers, and I think this is coming from a teacher, could personalize the learning experiences for their students. I think this is as true in an online world as it may be in an offline world.
It is very much. And I think, a lot of the frustration that I have with districts that are not doing well are the sense of one size fits all. Our children are not one size fits all. Their families, their communities, the way that they learn, they are not one size fits all. And I've seen too many districts where the learning happens one way. If you don't conform to that or you don't learn in that direction, then we blame the child, particularly for boys. And so that is a huge frustration. What if we can change that mindset? And I'm very thankful for that question. The teacher who's asking this doesn't have that mindset. How do you get out of that one size fits all? So it can be from low tech to high tech. Low tech, and it will depend somewhat on the age of the child. When you have older children, breaking into smaller groups, and I don't mean this by tracking, and sometimes what you actually want is to have students with different levels in terms of the content actually being in the same group. But having small groups, and if you're by yourself, being able to rotate around those groups, knowing that when you're not present, students learn from each other. The peer-to-peer learning being incredibly important. And the thought that has to go into it from the start is how you design and what are the tasks you have the students doing that allows for this kind of differentiation or personalization of where students are, and then the teacher rotating around. That's a very low-tech way of thinking about it. Another way to think about it, though, is if you are by yourself, you don't have teachers, aides, and others who can come in, although do think about how can you use parents, how can you use partners who can come into classrooms, who can be additional capacity so that you can break out and meet students where they are. Don't forget about that possibility. But if you are by yourself, it is part of the technology. Personalization means, again, lots of small group work, but if you are working with this group of students and this other group of students can be working on some particular program, and there is a huge range of programs out there, I think it would be fantastic for educators to compare notes and say, for this particular skill competency, here's a really great program that you could be using. For this other subject, you might want to use this. But again, knowing where your students are academically, being able to split them into groups and match them, whether it's with a person, with peers, or with some program or technology, really for short periods of time, are ways to think about personalization.
And just to take that point a little further, since you talked about peer-to-peer learning, and it's so important, any ideas on how one could promote and strengthen peer-to-peer learning in a virtual learning model, Bridget?
Yes. So, we're learning about what the different technologies offer us. For us, we've been using Zoom a lot. We're using it now. But breakout rooms, being smart about breakout rooms has been essential. So one, you have to think whether you're face-to-face or in a remote setting, which peers should be together. It's always helpful if you know a bit about the personalities and how they will gel or complement each other. And I know a lot of thought goes into that. But then those breakout rooms, when you put students in those rooms, and if you give them clear kind of direction, that's where you can see peer-to-peer learning. And if it's a small group, the videos, you're still able to hold lots of kinds of conversations. But you can also think about this asynchronously. And this is how we are building some of our online courses, the models, where students are responding to some prompts, and the discussion is happening by people typing in a chat that may be happening, again, in an asynchronous kind of way, but they're building off of each other and they are in conversation with each other. And so obviously this lends itself much more to older students, but there are multiple ways to do this. And again, the chat we're finding for some of our students who are a little bit shyer, on the shyer side, or a little bit more unsure, gives them more time to be thoughtful. And so you actually see, relative to just verbal discussion, these online discussion chats where people are writing, you're actually seeing them push the material much further because they're able to be a bit more thoughtful, and it isn't just a rush in the moment, but the learning is still happening peer-to-peer.
It's a question which has been presented by multiple people in different ways. I'll try and synthesize it for you, Bridget. And you admit students from around the world at the HGSE, obviously as a graduate school, but the university, the broader Harvard University, has the undergraduate, the college program. And I think one of the things that everybody is struggling with a little bit, students who are coming out of school and colleges that are accepting students who are coming out of school, is what is the admission process and how will grades be assessed? So I think people have asked the question in different ways, ranging from how will Harvard assess this year, in how will those grades, which are sort of the last semester, or which is online grades or grades that have just been given as a flat grading system, affect people's admissions that they may already have been granted or otherwise. And at the other end is, how should, given this may continue for the next few months or maybe into the next academic year, is definitely in the fall semester in most places, even in schools, how should students be thinking about it for next year? So
yeah, I think this is one where there is a great deal of variation even within Harvard. We at the Harvard Graduate School of Education personally decided not to make students be automatic pass-fail, meaning basically flattening what the grades were. We gave them choice. And we also asked our faculty to be very flexible, but we knew, again, given the fact we switched to remote 75% into the semester, some students wanted the grades, they had done the work, they were still demonstrating it. And so if they needed it for future applications, doctoral applications, jobs and so forth, we want to give them that choice. That differed for other parts of the university. And I think a lot of it just was everything switched so quickly, and there was a great deal of stress and uncertainty, which we also knew was impacting students. So we wanted to be as generous with them as possible. As we look to the fall, it's not a sustainable process not to be able to have grades, not to be able to judge, the quality of work, to have some assessment of whether or not students have the skills and how well they did. And you really want to be able to both recognize and congratulate those who achieve at a very high level, as well as identify those who really aren't getting the content. I think a number of districts, particularly primary and secondary schools that went to no grades, are now starting to worry a great deal that maybe that wasn't the way that it happened. Maybe that wasn't actually the best thing to do, which it's making it harder for when students return next fall to know what anybody knows at all, which is again why I made the recommendation about the need for formative assessments. So, longer term, the Harvards of the world, for those who are thinking about that, for admissions, I actually don't think that we have to worry too much about Harvard. So Harvard's admissions for all of our schools is holistic review, which means one grade, one GPA, one test score doesn't decide whether or not you're in. We have very large staffs. We have faculty that are very involved in our admissions processes, where we're looking at multiple indicators. For the graduate school of education, we're much more concerned about your classes, your writing classes, your narratives, than we are about the GRE. In fact, we have been considering going a GRE, which is the big test in the US, going optional for years, because it doesn't actually give us very much value. What we're really paying attention to is the transcript and the narrative. And this is, I think, generally speaking for Harvard, they're looking at lots of different indicators and looking for evidence that the student is academically prepared. And so many of the other pieces that make a difference are about leadership and are about service, and not something that's going to be captured in a grade anyways. What I do worry about is for schools where admission is just by a test score, a simple test score or a simple GPA, without all that other rich information that gives you some indication about the student, because that's where we start not to trust, the GPAs. That's where we start not to trust, testing around the world. And in the US, there's big questions about the SAT and, our very big test, because students have not been able to take it online. Taking it at home online, it doesn't seem to be working. And there's lots of concerns in those environments around the world about cheating. Is this really your own work? And I think that's an area where we're starting to have a lot of people pay a great deal of attention to. I know at Harvard, even for some of our online courses, there already is technology in terms of typing, in terms of the video camera and eyes, that somehow detects whether or not you are who you say you are. But those technologies are not ones that all schools have or have the resources to have. So again, I don't worry too much about the Harvards of the world, the really selective institutions who have large teams to look holistically, who have other kinds of technologies. But I do worry for those high stakes admissions that are based on one test score, one GPA, how they're going to account for the fact that we do have this lost semester, and we do have this even next year that's going to be full of disruption.
Thanks, Bridget. Another question, again, 2-3 members of the audience have said this in different ways. I'll try and address it into one question, which is really of collaboration among schools and universities and educators, really, to come up with a common vision of transforming students. If that is the common vision of most educational institutions, how can they share best practices which are working for them in this journey of transformation that everybody is doing, to build up a more effective teaching learning network? And this, for the GSE, is kind of like the sweet spot, right? So it's aptly directed to you, Bridget.
Okay. So the thing that I take away some optimism is, unlike almost any other time that I've seen in American education policy, is there's much more focus on understanding we want children to learn, and we want them to be supported in terms of their mental health, social emotional learning and development. And what the crisis did is it boiled it down to those two things very quickly, And I haven't seen a lot of disagreement about that. The second reason I have optimism is we finally now are having conversations, really realizing, and this is a completely obvious point, but context matters. So while we are all focused on these similar goals, we do realize how it is going to look in Chicago versus New York versus anywhere around the world is going to be different, because every community, families, the assets and deficits that they have, the other organizations, and even just how intense COVID has been in impacting health, and whether or not there's stay-at-home orders and quarantines, there's tremendous amount of variation. So I have seen this renewed discussion of saying, yes, these are our goals, but we do realize that different schools are going to get to that goal in different ways, which again, makes the importance of sharing practices. And then the third thing that gives me optimism is because we all went through this and this major shock in a very short amount of time, where we're all basically coming together, and there aren't too many schools who are coming as the authoritative leaders being critical of other schools. Again, we're all kind of muddling through this. So this is a time when it's been somewhat of a safe time to share practices. And I've seen much more of the growth mindset across leaders, across educators, where everyone is trying to figure this out and this common goal. And I've seen much more sharing of what has actually worked. So again, in terms of sharing, I think it's just a little bit of finding some commonality and then having conversation. And our approach, my approach, both as a leader of my own institution and what I've also seen in other areas, is connecting principals with principals and teachers with teachers. The work is getting done is at the school level, not at big systems. It's in the classroom level. And so having one teacher talk to another teacher has been incredibly valuable, but we have to set up those forums to allow that to happen. Where mistakes have been made is when I instead see this kind of top-down district telling people this is what you need to do, when that's not their lived reality, that's not what their students, what they're seeing with their students, it's not addressing what they need. But if you can quickly build these groups with some kind of commonality, with something similar in the context, or just even sharing ideas. And this doesn't have to even be face-to-face. This is, again, we've been experimenting with just discussion boards, and you just see a wealth of information where teachers sharing, well, I tried this and this worked. You might check out this website. You might use this resource. And one thing I think that we are going to have to try to do as researchers at Harvard is help to distill the vast amounts of information that are coming in, because as an individual teacher, you don't have time to read and discern what really is going on. So that's, I think, part of our role in this process, is to try to distill that very, very quickly so we can help empower the educators who need it.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions, and let me take this first one from the audience again.
And let me just say really quickly, I do know from the chat, people don't like to share their mistakes. I completely understand that. I've actually been surprised at how many times I have seen teachers say, this is not working. They oftentimes will blame the district did not, or the school did not give them enough resources and supports. But I have seen a lot more people saying, this is not working, I need another solution. And that, I feel, again, this is something that gives me optimism, is completely different than anything we have seen in the last 20 years, where no, you would never admit things are not working. But now you have something external to be able to blame, which I think is opening up conversations more.
Right. So I think this goes to the question of the other people in that virtual environment, which is for a large part of the middle class, and for the salaried class, especially in white-collar jobs, they're having to work from home, the parents. So in many double-income homes, which is a vast majority of the working population in many countries, especially in India, you have this challenge of the parents trying to work from home virtually and having to be on Zoom calls and video calls and audio calls, and the children going through half of that day on virtual calls, needing a lot of parental support to get through that process, where schools also, for concerns of security concerns, for what content might be shared online with a child, need supervision, because the child is online and you don't necessarily know whether they're accessing the school's protocol syllabus or they're accessing something else. And oftentimes parents, even the most well-meaning parents, are getting frustrated because it almost seems like a tension between their work and being able to supervise their child. And you see children almost being forced back to school for that reason, where it may not be safe for them. So how does one think about it? What are the things one could do to handle that kind of situation? Any sort of thoughts on that, Bridget?
Yes, absolutely. You have completely described the major problems, and it varies tremendously by age. The younger kids are the ones where we've had the most difficulty, where it is, they're not old enough to really be able to sit machines. They may not know how to use the machines. Their parents are busy trying to work. I say this as a parent of a 10 and a 12-year-old, where I'm thankful that they are just old enough. They can read, they can write, they know computers. They have been mostly independent, and I check in more for accountability that they're actually doing what they need to do. And even for high school students, I've heard very good data and information that they can work independently, and that has gone smoothly. But yes, it is the smallest children where it has been the most difficult. And I'm not sure what people have found to really work, but several ideas. One, I think, the technology does matter a lot. For the older kids, we can throw them on Chromebooks, they can use Google Classroom and so forth. For the younger kids, I think the technologies that they best interact with are more iPads, is more kind of apps and so forth, but not the whole kind of laptop, because they can't quite handle that themselves. And a lot of the apps, there's a strong set of apps for smaller kids that are engaging, developmentally appropriate, and the technology is just so much easier. But then you have the problem with how do you get iPads in kids' hands? The second thing, though, that there's been a big push on is television. So, we have the tradition of Sesame Street, which the Harvard Graduate School of Education helped found 50 years ago, and we had just celebrated that anniversary in October. But you have public television, and there's been a big push of what, for particularly the smaller kids, we can be putting on television for them to have. And again, that's Sesame Street, that's Electric Company, that's all kinds of other types of things. So again, getting away from the laptops, television might actually be more appropriate. And I don't know that it came together, but with more time and more planning, some districts were in conversation with local public television about what they could put to kind of supplement or kind of replace for those younger kids. And then the third thing, in some of my conversation, a friend of Harvard is thinking about what YouTube is doing. Again, this is more videos. And I think that gets to personalization. I mean, the hard thing with YouTube is it has everything under the sun and a lot that's not developmentally appropriate for students. And again, as a mother, this is the one that I have to watch closely with my own children to make sure they're not in appropriate spaces. But there is a great deal of educational content on YouTube. And I do know some friends, parents with smaller kids, whether it's the science videos or animal videos or things like that, if there's a way to somehow designate and figure out which one of those videos, and this again gets to personalization, meeting kids where they are, there's a wealth of information there. I think we're in a point in time where we just need to figure out how do we sort through this technology and these resources that are available to us, figure out what is the high quality work, and then how do we match it with particular age groups, particular needs, particular contexts. But that's been another possibility. As we look forward, the most successful families in my reading of the literature is for the younger kids, you have to give asynchronous work, because you have to allow for parents are going to have to support these students, support their children. So you can't have it all be done at the same time at 8 o'clock, because that may be when this parents have to work. You may have to have something that this parent can do with the child later in the day if they can carve out some time. Because again, yes, we are conflicting. We're going right up against, and I'm speaking of someone where at 8 o'clock you have 4 Zoom sessions going on between my husband, myself, and my 2 kids. It gets to be overwhelming, and we have to think more creatively about schedules. If I can be, a present parent, making sure my child is doing what they need.
talking about schedules, and I'm very cognizant that we are at the end of our time for today. I'm also very cognizant that it's 8:05 in the morning on a Saturday morning in Boston, and it's 8:05 evening in Singapore where I am, but late in the evening in India as well on a Saturday. And I know that children have been, left to their own devices for most of the week, and you would
They
like
have
to.
not come barging in yet, so we're.
And I'm sure that many participants have children waiting at home who they would like to get back to. So I would like to, on behalf of Ashoka University, the conference organizers, all of us, and particularly me personally, Bridget, thank you for taking so much time, sharing your thoughts with us, sharing what you see as the opportunities, what you see as the challenges, of course, but what you see as the opportunities out of these challenges, I think, and the bright sort of light at the end of the tunnel, if we have it, which I'm sure we will. So I'm joined by multiple people on the chat I can see, in thanking you for taking this time to speak to us and share your thoughts on topics that are extremely important to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone, and thank you for what you're doing. This work could not be more important. Good luck to you, and if we can be a resource, please do reach out.
We will.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget.